Tennessee Life is sponsored by
Mid-South Sewing and Fabric has what you need for your creative adventure. If it's sewing, embroidery, or vinyl projects you need for a home business, Etsy, Pinterest, and your family, we have it. Mid-South Sewing sells Brothers Sewing and Embroidery machines and the latest scan and cut crafting machine. Mid-South Sewing and Fabric in the Gallery Shopping Center.
Tennessee Life is also brought to you by The Flower Pot. For over 100 years, offering flowers and same-day delivery with 2 convenient Knoxville locations. KnoxvilleFlowerPot.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Tennessee Life. I'm Vickie Lawson. Ken Burns, historian, producer, and filmmaker. From his earliest works, he has explored the American condition. His award-winning series, The Civil War, is one of the most popular programs in PBS's history. And he has been steadily releasing projects on subjects as varied as jazz, baseball, prohibition, World War II, and national parks. I was able to catch up with Burns in East Tennessee as he was promoting his latest documentary, Country Music. What instilled a love for history for you?
You know, I think growing up, I was always aware that I kind of liked the stuff that had gone before. I think it might have been from my granddaddy and my daddy who were interested in new stuff like that. My brother, who almost the same age, a little bit younger, was reading fiction. I was reading encyclopedias and nonfiction and history. I think the biggest thing, though, is that my mother had cancer from about the time I was 2 years old and died a little bit before my 12th birthday when I was 11. And many, many, many years later, I met my late father-in-law said to me that, he said, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "You wake the dead. You make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson and whomever. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up?" And so I think it may be a simplistic way to say that that kind of loss that takes place, it's so irreplaceable. There's never been a day since my mother died, which is, you know, almost 55 years ago, that I haven't thought about her. And that I think that in some ways the work that I do is in a way an attempt to honor that memory, to wake the dead that I can't wake up, if you know what I mean. And so I'm deeply committed to American history. All of it is not with her in mind, but I know that in some ways that impulse and that curiosity about the people who are gone and the way in which they can still teach us is very much worked into my own personal history.
What are some of the defining influences in your documentary filmmaking?
There are a couple really noticeable and important ones. First is my dad, who is a cultural anthropologist. He was an amateur photographer, so my very first memory was in Newark, Delaware. He was the only anthropologist in the state of Delaware, and we just moved there in 1955, and he built in our basement, unfinished basement, a little dark room. And I can remember the stud walls going up and the masonite that was going to encase it. And then the next memory I have is of being held in his arm, in his strong left arm, as his right arm, you know, had the tongs that was swishing the paper, the blank paper, that in the weird smell of the chemicals and in the red light of the eerie red light of the darkroom, suddenly this magic takes place. A photograph comes up, and that I've always been struck by that. And my first teachers in college, I went to Hampshire College, which was an experimental school, started in 1970. I came in the fall of '71, and I wanted to be a filmmaker, but all of my teachers were social documentary still photographers as well as documentary filmmakers. They weren't interested in Hollywood. They said, Hollywood says it's the industry. You don't want to make industrial products. You want to make something else. And so, rooted in still photography and then documentary, I had sort of my desire to be a filmmaker, which had been born very, very early. Just after my mom died, I watched my dad cry at an old movie. Funny, the movie was on TV last night at the hotel. I hadn't seen it since then, and my dad cried at it, and I realized that he hadn't been able to cry at all the stuff that had happened when my mom was sick or when she died or at the funeral. But the movies gave him an emotional safe haven. And so I I said, that's what I wanted to be. I was 12 years old. I remember, I go, that's what I want to do. And that meant being Alfred Hitchcock or Howard Hawks or John Ford, a Hollywood thing. And when I got to Hampshire, I don't recognize the person who came in and the person came out. They not only rearranged my molecules and made me sort of on the surface interested in documentaries, but they armed me with how to explore things. And so I just came out sort of unwilling to go apprentice myself to anybody else. I started my own film company with a couple of friends, and I've been my own boss, which is like, you know, the foolish thing for, you know, since 1975. And that's been tough, and it's also been joyful and liberating. I think I have the best job in the country. It educates all my parts. I work with extraordinary people. We're not doing brain surgery, so I don't let anybody, including myself, yell at anybody else. And we live together in this tiny little village in New Hampshire that permits us the splendid isolation to do the deep dives on the work we've done. So I've lived in the same house, slept in the same bedroom for 40 years, just trying to practice, you know, like whittling, you know, trying to practice my craft.
Whittling, that is in East Tennessee.
Yep. No, I know. It's something I inherited from my daddy and granddaddy. We're just up the road, maybe about 4 or 5 hours. You could get to Hot Springs, Virginia, and maybe 14 miles north of that is Burnsville, where my great-great-granddaddy is buried, and lots of other people dating back to the 18th century who came.
You've had a long partnership with PBS television, including your 1990 series, The Civil War, which still to this day is the highest rated documentary on PBS. Why did you take that project on?
Well, the Civil War is the most important event in all of American history. Not the Revolution, not other events that have taken place. This is the defining event in who we are. We were founded 85 years before on the principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence, written by a Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, who said that all men are created equal. And yet he owned other human beings. And the Civil War would have to be fought eventually to sort of decide that and a lot of other thorny issues that had come up around how we were going to configure. And it's still, you know, one of the last comments is by the historian Barbara Fields in the film said the Civil War is still going on and it can still be lost. And so, you know, there's still divisions in our country that exist. And so I think I felt I had made several films before that, one on the Brooklyn Bridge. It wouldn't have been built without this new metal called steel that the Civil War helped to promote the use of. The guy who built the Brooklyn Bridge, Washington Roebling, got his practical training in the Union Army as a bridge builder. The second film I made was on the celibate religious sect, the Shakers, and they declined precipitously after the Civil War, not because of the celibacy that they adhered to. Many other groups had that, but they were very successful. It's that the questions of the soul's survival was not as important in America after the Civil War, after you'd murdered, now we believe, 750,000 of our own people. The next film I made was on Huey Long, the turbulent Southern demagogue from Louisiana. His dirt-poor North Louisiana parish refused to secede from the Union. They felt the Confederacy, the ownership of slaves, was a rich man's cause, and they weren't rich people. And so they became a hotbed of radicalism, populism, even socialism that eventually spawned this very complicated person, Huey Long. Next film I made was on the Statue of Liberty, which was originally intended to be a gift from the French to Mrs. Lincoln to celebrate the survival of the country despite her husband's ultimate sacrifice. And every film we made, the next one was the Congress, which had its biggest test when there were two Congresses, one in Washington, D.C., and the other in Montgomery, and later Alabama, and then later Richmond, Virginia. So it was just begging to be done, and I think naively dove into it, but it became the sort of seminal work of my life. Let us just say there is only one place that film could have been made, and that's in public broadcasting. PBS is the only person, in all my films, from the first one, Brooklyn Bridge, to the one right now that we're talking about, country music, they couldn't have been made anyplace else. It's the deep dive that we're able to do, the amount of time it takes, the research. We don't need focus groups to tell us how to pick the subjects. They've been great. I like the P in it, the public in it. I like the S in it. It's not system, it's service. We're in service. And I think too much of what we do is mercantile, but if you think about it, there's nothing wrong with that. This is a network that has one foot tentatively in the marketplace and the other proudly out of it, where we just happen to produce unlimited budgets, shoestring budgets, the best children's, the best science, the best nature, the best public affairs, and I'm told the best history on the dial. That ought to be pretty good reason to stay. And so I've had a lot of suitors come and try to lure me away, but I'm leaving the dance with them that brung me.
As you learned about the Civil War, did you hear stories about Tennessee that you found to be extremely interesting?
I don't think I found a story about the Civil War that wasn't interesting. We like to call it brother against brother. It wasn't. It was a section against section. Our revolution, which I'm now working on, the American Revolution, is more brother against brother, family struggles. So Benjamin Franklin's own son was the royal governor of New Jersey and never came over to the revolutionary side, and Franklin never talked to him again and ostracized him, and he ended up, having to move to New Brunswick in Canada. But what happened is the passions that were aroused in a country that had someone once said that the Civil War was a bloody lake, that it was American history is a clear river that ran into a bloody lake, the Civil War, and then ran out clear again. Like, how is it possible that this blessed land murdered in 4 short years, 750,000, more than 2% of our population? And then, even though the scars of it, the wounds, the divisions of it come up, lesser and sometimes greater in others, it seems inconceivable that we will have torn ourselves in two in order to be one. And let me give you an idea about that, which is that before the war, when speaking about our country, people would say the United States are. They saw ourselves as a collection of states. After the war, we began to refer to ourselves as a nation, which is a one thing, and we say today the United States is the greatest country on earth, right? Mm-hmm. That's ungrammatical. The United States is. It's like saying these chairs is beautiful. But we do it, and if it didn't settle the differences between people based not on the content of their character, but on the color of their skin, as Dr. King said. If it didn't solve this or that or the other thing, it did solve that thing, which is it made us a one thing. It took us from an are to an is. And in that transformation, dramas happen, intimate dramas in Tennessee and in my state now of New Hampshire, my adopted state, in Michigan where I lived, in Delaware, which was half slave and half free, in Maryland, places I've lived, Virginia where my people are from, of course. It is still the most compelling story we have, and still we can learn from it, and still we can realize the ways in which unfortunately we're still prisoners of it.
Well, being in the great state of Tennessee, are there a couple of quick stories that you could share with us that just kind of come to mind?
Well, to me, Tennessee is people, because of the amount of photography on the east, and Robert E. Lee is the head of the Army of Northern Virginia, there's just lots more stuff that comes up there. But Tennessee is the West in the theater of the Civil War, and it is known for a couple of really important battles. One is the Battle of Shiloh, or Pittsburgh Landing. It is, a Union defeat, certainly, and then all of a sudden it turns into pretty much a Union victory that permits the Tennessee and the Cumberland to be into Union control, and the Mississippi from, Memphis on up. And the other is just one of the worst battles of the Civil War is Franklin. It's just a really bloody affair, and if you read the stories of Franklin, it's sad. The war was already, its ending was decided before it began. Sam Houston predicted this when he was overthrown as governor of Texas when he didn't want to secede. He just said, "You just don't understand. You Southerners just don't understand the Northern folks. They come from colder climates, they're less passionate and angry than us, but when they get started, they will move like a mighty avalanche and bury us." Nobody listened to that, and what happens is that very early on, despite many Southern victories, it's really clear that, as Shelby Foote told us, the North was fighting the war with one arm tied behind his back, and when it took that other arm out, it was going to change things. And Franklin's one of those horrible, horrible, bloody battles that now, in retrospect, you go, did we need to lose so many people, North and South, in that battle? It's just, to me, a great tragedy.
You have done documentaries on a variety of topics. What made you choose country music this time?
All of my I'm glad you said a variety of topics, because I sort of think I've made the same film over and over again, and it's asking the same question: who are we? Who are those strange and complicated people who like to call themselves Americans? And what does an investigation of that subject tell us about not only where we were, but where we are now and where we may be going? And so I feel like I've made the same film over and over again. So thank you for seeing that as a diverse number of topics. I look for topics that are American history firing on all cylinders, things that are quintessentially American, that are not superficial, that just have resonance and depth and undertow and complication and contradiction. Wynton Marsalis said to me in jazz, sometimes a thing and the opposite of a thing can be true at the same time, and good storytelling always understands that, always understands that. So it's why I picked the Civil War, it's why I picked country music. Country music is a great way to talk about the space that I occupy, which is between the two-letter, lowercase, plural pronoun us, and all the warmth that that's about. We and our are also right there next to it. And then the U.S., the capital letters, the U.S. And all my films exist in that space. The intimacy of the storytelling from a bottom-up sense, what the ordinary soldier is doing, what Sam Watkins from Company H of Tennessee Volunteers is doing in the Civil War, as well as his northern counterpart, Elisha Hunt Rhodes from Rhode Island, but also what's happening from the top down, what's going through the mind of Jefferson Davis, or Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, or Abraham Lincoln, and William Tecumseh Sherman, and U.S. Grant. This is what I'm interested in, and the intersection of that. So when you have country music, which is telling the stories of people who feel like in many ways their stories haven't been told, that they're part of a flyover country, and that there's a kind of coastal bias that doesn't support them. And yet this music is the dominant music in the United States today. And how it went from being old-time hill country music, born right around here, to what it is today is an amazing, amazing story. And it's not a sophisticated music like classical music. It's three chords and the truth, the songwriter Harlan Howard said. But what that permits is that for very elemental music, and for the most part very elemental human poetry, I mean, its greatest composers like Hank Williams, he's called the hillbilly Shakespeare, or Merle Haggard, he's called the poet of the common man. They're able to distill sort of essential human emotions into very simple things. I mean, when Hank Williams writes, "I'm so lonesome I could cry," there's not a person on the planet that doesn't understand exactly what he means. And he does it so simply and so eloquently that you get a direct shot of human emotion. It's the three chords and the truth. And so what is country music about? Everybody makes jokes about it. It's pickup trucks and hound dogs and six-packs of beer. It's not about that. It's about the joy of birth and the sadness of death. It's about falling in love and falling out of love. It's about losing someone and missing someone and being lonesome and seeking redemption. All of those things are the main things of country music. And so its fans are everywhere. I mean, my first time I ever heard of Dolly Parton was tumbling out of an office in 1977 in New York City, near City Hall, where suddenly there are 20,000 people there listening to Dolly Parton sing. And I said, "Who is that?" They said, "Dolly Parton." I said, "That's Dolly Parton? That's the most beautiful voice I'd ever heard." And it was resonating through the canyons of Lower Manhattan. And I then had 10 years later a chance, or 15 years later, a chance to meet her. And then I had, just a couple years ago, the great chance to interview her for our film and celebrate her in many chapters of our film, this extraordinary continuation of the legacy of Hank Williams and Merle Haggard, of a great songwriter, a great voice, a great personality, and someone who never got above her raisin, someone who's not too rich, not too famous, not to this, to somehow forget where she came from.
As you took your music journey through Tennessee. Can you share some of the most notable places you have visited?
Well, I think Bristol and the area where they call it the Big Bang happened. It was the summer of 1927. Ralph Peer, who we begin our film with, has been recording old-time country artists, hill country artists, since 1923. He's done Fiddlin' John Carson. There are a few other people. Pop Stoneman, Eck Robertson has been recorded, and Stoneman finally says, you know what, there are lots more people down where I come from in Galax, Virginia. If you come down to that area and set up, you can get us. And Ralph Peer goes and sets up in 1927 in Bristol, and records a lot of people, but it's notable for the fact that he recorded the Carter family and then a few days later, Jimmie Rodgers. And those are the twin polarities of the beginning of it, the Sunday morning of the Carter family and the Saturday night of Jimmie Rodgers. And that's true in jazz, it's true in blues, it's true in rock. It's all that tension between the old time values and the carouser and the person who needs to go to church the next morning. And that's where the Big Bang happened. So there's something very powerful about this. And of course, Nashville, accidentally. Why is Nashville Music City, USA? Well, there's an insurance company, and to sell insurance, they started a radio station. And they've got lots of different programming, including classical music from New York, but they, like every other station in Chicago and in Charlotte and in Dallas and elsewhere, they have a barn dance. And one day after they hear from a symphony orchestra, the announcer says, well, you've been listening to the Grand Ole Opera, now let's listen to the Grand Ole Opry. So they changed the name from the barn dance to the Grand Ole Opry. And then all of a sudden, they're attracting artists who are appearing on this. It becomes the most famous, and it's centrally located because they don't pay you much, but if you can get to lots of different venues, if you can get back there by the next Saturday night, and they're selling insurance policies, so they're getting more and more notoriety, and then songwriters are coming there, because if that's where song singers are, then songwriters, and all of a sudden, an entire industry of hillbillies is there in the Athens of the South, which is not sitting very well with the upper crust of Nashville. But eventually, the amount of money that is made, the size of the industry, even the snootiest of folks in Belle Meade have to look over and say, okay, they're doing something right. And one of the great stories in country music is, of course, Sarah Ophelia Cannon, to the manor born, lives in Belle Meade, went to Ward Belmont Finishing School, but she also got a bug for acting, and somewhere along the line she started making up a fictional town and populating it with people she'd met in her travels in the rural South, particularly in Alabama. And she called her little fictional place Grinder's Switch, and she made fun of herself, and she dressed herself in sort of simple country clothes, left the price tag on the hat, and called herself Minnie Pearl. But every time she was off stage, she was this very well-spoken, to the manor born. And the great thing about her is that she made fun of herself, but she didn't make fun of everybody else. She permitted hillbillies to feel like they belonged, that there was a place at the table. And I think at the end, what we're doing with this series, and I think this is as good as our Civil War series, if not better, is just making a place at the table for everybody.
In a time when people take in media and entertainment has changed so much, why do you think long-form documentaries still are so important?
You know, it's so interesting. When I made the Civil War, the television press would say, Ken, this is so good, but no one's going to watch it. Everybody's got an MTV, quick-cutting sensibility, 2.5, 3 minutes. They said that about baseball, they said that about jazz, they said that about World War II and the national parks. They didn't say that about the Roosevelts, and they didn't say that about Vietnam, and they're not saying that about country music. And this is why. Even though we're in YouTube and everybody thinks that, you know, and they did say, you know, in the early days of YouTube, oh, you know, their attention span is down to 2 minutes of a kitty playing with a ball of yarn, you know. We're all starved for meaning in our lives. And all real meaning accrues in duration. The work you're proudest of, the relationships you care the most about, have benefited from your sustained attention. And we live in a media culture in which there is a tsunami of information. And the only thing we can do against it, because we can't possibly comprehend the whole, is to self-select, essentially to curate or to trust others to curate. And so when the Roosevelts came out in 2014, everybody knew there were going to be millions of people binging it, because you want somehow to shut out all of that. And maybe that's not us, maybe it's Grain of Thrones, or maybe it's Downton Abbey that is us, or maybe it's something else. But people want that sense that if I trust this brand, PBS, I know Ken Burns' films. I'm not a big country music fan, or I am a big country music fan. I'm going to trust it, and if we tell a good enough story, we're going to have it.
Ken Burns, thank you for spending time with us on Tennessee Life today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tennessee Life is sponsored by
Mid-South Sewing and Fabric has what you need for your creative adventure. If it's sewing, embroidery, or vinyl projects you need for a home business, Etsy, Pinterest, and your family, we have it. Mid-South Sewing sells Brothers Sewing and Embroidery machines and the latest scan and cut crafting machine. Mid-South Sewing and Fabric in the Gallery Shopping Center.
Tennessee Life is also brought to you by The Flower Pot. For over 100 years, offering flowers and same-day delivery with 2 convenient Knoxville locations. KnoxvilleFlowerPot.com. And by viewers like you. Thank you. We want to hear about your Tennessee Life. If you know of a person or story you would like to see featured on this program, please write to the address on the screen.